Hello and welcome once again to the Dr. Zeero Free Magic Secret Show, where we investigate all forms of magic. And today is a special, sorely needed episode talking a little bit about the Druids of the Celtic Empire, what was known as the Celtic Empire. Now, what we know about the Druids, historically accurate, is very marginal, scant information, mostly coming from the Romans and their writers, historians, who, of course, were the victors of the war, and to the victors goes the writing of history. And we have some scant recollections from that side of the fence, but also embedded in Irish literature and literature from Wales and from England, Britain. We have things that we know about them. So the one thing to know here when asking the question, what was going on? So the Celtic Empire was very vast, okay? And it's spread through most of Europe. And the thing was, there was no, central emperor, what have you, or central king that ran the whole show. It was basically a bunch of different tribes that were interconnected by one thing, the Druids themselves, who basically ran the entire operation. So, in a sense, they're their own mafia. They're their own mob, you could say. And surely they were corrupt, just as any political operation is corrupt. But let's talk about what they were. So they got wiped out in 60 AD, sometime around there, 60 AD, perhaps 62 AD. There was a Roman invasion of the British Isles. And first there was the war in Gaul. And Gaul was basically like Belgium and France back in the day. And those people were ran by the Druids. And of course, the Druids were the only major competing political party in all of Europe outside Rome itself. So naturally, they were a threat and they had to be disposed of. So what were they? Well, to be a Druid, you had to study for at least 20 years. And it was all oral tradition and memory work. They had to memorize everything, right? And there were 3 classes of Druids. The first class, where you started out, you would be a bard, and that was like a poet, a singer, a musician. The second step was known as the ovate grade, or possibly vates. But they were sort of like the witchy seers, the diviners of they were like the middlemen for the proper Druids. And the proper Druids themselves, when you finally reached that rank, they were doctors, lawyers, philosophers in their own right. They were shamans. They were basically like walking human Google search engines. It was sort of like an ancient society that, you don't have Google, you don't have the way to look up any information. These guys knew everything because they were trained to know everything. And they were so powerful that if, say, 2 tribes were at war with one another on a battlefield and a Druid just walked out and raised their hands for everybody to stop fighting, everybody would stop fighting and lay down their arms. This is the kind of power that the Druids had over the whole society. And they were looked at just as powerful in a lot of instances as the kings and of themselves. So all the royal courts had a Druid that would be like the advisor to the court, And so there's this huge, massive edifice of information that's just lost to history because they didn't write their stuff down. And if they did, the Romans burned it all, destroyed it. So it's one of these enchanting mysteries of magic and enchanting mysteries of history where we're always trying to learn about these characters. There's an absolutely excellent book. It's just called The Druids by Peter Ellis Besteford, I believe. And that one gets right to the point of everything we know about the Druids in a historical context and such. And there's one of the other great books. There's a book called Talesian, which is one of the authentic leftover writings from someone who was like a chief bard in the 4th century AD that would have been in the British Isles. So these are good sources of information for lore and everything. So I just wanted to read briefly a book called Encyclopedia of Celtic Wisdom. Now, that's a very deceptive title because this book is just chock full of Celtic magic. And it's by Caitlin and John Matthews, who did a number of other books on this subject. And I just wanted to read the chapter called Druids and Vision Poets, because it'll give you a taste of what was going on here. Now, the name Druid, Irish Druid, Welsh Druid, is ultimately derived from the Sanskrit root Veda, to see or know. It is also inextricably associated with the oak, Irish Dwar, Welsh Dur, and Gaulish Dervo. The Druidic task was a shamanic one, requiring a deep and encyclopedic knowledge of the many branches of wisdom, art, and science, and an ability to interrelate the many dimensions of the other world. Druids, both male and female, acted as the counselors, philosophers, shapeshifters, diviners, and magicians of rulers. Among the Celts, the honor price, a kind of insurance premium or recompense payable for insult or injury, of a Druid was the same as that of a king, which may convey the awe and respect in which Druids were held. The Romans rightly recognized that to overcome the Celts, they must first disable their intellectuals. After the Roman invasion of Britain, Druidry was prescribed, the British Druidic headquarters on Anglesey was destroyed, and much of the Druidic network and practice was fragmented. However, Ireland suffered no such invasion, and it is for this reason that literary references to the Druidic tradition of the insular Celts are frequent in the Irish texts, providing a richness of material absent from most British and Gaulish material. Its Druidic practices continued into and beyond the establishment of Christianity as the major religion in the 5th century. In Ireland, training in Druidry was cellular. One Druid might take a handful of students or just one or two. Trainees of a particular teacher formed certain spiritual lineages, recognizable teaching styles, and practical skills, just as in Tibet, individual Buddhist masters were responsible for founding certain Tibetan Buddhist lineages or orders. Teaching was not unlike that of the poets by means of oral instruction and practical example. As with modern university systems, students sought out Druidic teachers versed in specialist skills, often traveling long distances, even overseas, to benefit from their wisdom. We see this in the story of Ned, who goes to a famous school in Alba, which was known as Scotland. Throughout the ancient Celtic world, before Christianity or political conquest entered into the reckoning, there were Druidic assemblies and possibly larger teaching units or colleges. Britain and Alba seem to have a scholastic primacy among the Celtic countries, as many Gaulish students were sent for training in Britain, just as Irish students traveled to Alba. We do not know the reason for this, just as we cannot fully understand to what extent the Druids of the Celts were influenced or drew upon the skills of indigenous shamanic traditions. The overlap of local indigenous shamanic tradition and official Druidic practice is difficult to judge in Britain and in Ireland. We hear of the Nemidian Druid, Magick, overcoming the indigenous Druids by cutting out their tongues, thus effectively silencing them. This must be seen as a symbolic paradigm of what happened when the Celtic peoples arrived in Ireland, the silencing of indigenous spiritual leaders and the purloining of their sacred sites for the invaders' own use. Whether we look at Tara or Jerusalem, this pattern is repeated worldwide. Many Indo-European scholars have pointed out the close parallels between the Druid and the Hindu Brahmin priest, concluding that the mainstream Indo-European expansion of the Celts brought Druidic practice to Britain and Ireland. But was a native Druidry already established? It is beguiling to draw a parallel between the coming of Celtic Druidry to Britain and Ireland and the coming of Buddhism to Tibet. When Buddhist missionaries entered Tibet in the 7th century AD, they encountered the shamanic practitioners of the Bonpo religion. Almost immediately, a subtle synthesis began whereby Buddhism acquired a particularly Tibetan flavor. The shamanic elements of Banpo are still discernible in modern Tibetan Buddhist practice. Ritual trance and dance, the incorporation of Banpo spirits as Buddhist Dharma protectors, a complex, exact, and practical understanding of the inner worlds, and an ability to journey or meditate. Incidentally, in a peculiarly resonant parallel to the fate of British Druidry in AD 64, Tibetan Buddhist practitioners suffered a severe intellectual and spiritual pogrom when China invaded Tibet in 1950. The wholesale destruction, torture, and persecution of Buddhist monks, nuns, and teachers may help us grasp the plight of British Druids under the Romans' heel. In such times, memory is swiftly eradicated or stubbornly and secretly retained. It is possible that earlier shamanic or Druidic practitioners were incorporated within Celtic Druidry in a similar way to the incorporations of Banpo elements into Tibetan Buddhism. That there should have been no exchange of wisdom seems unlikely. Even under the Roman dispensation, at local British shrines incorporated into Romano-British usage, indigenous shrine guardians were encouraged to continue their important duties. It was the national and regional Druidic networks that were permanently disabled. Under Christianity, Irish Druids found their practices becoming less fashionable, and although some enjoyed individual royal patronage under pagan rulers, most found it easier to maintain status and power by becoming clerics themselves. The Celtic Christian practice of married clerics and hereditary rights, a parallel to Irish Druidic practice, seems to confirm such a notion. The decline of Druidism among the Celts does not rule out those maverick individuals who continued to practice and teach. And this is, never knew how to pronounce the name right. I believe it's Mogroith, Mogroith, is a prime example. He was known as the blind Druid, and he was quite famous in his times. But anyway, so from the Irish evidence, it is clear that isolated fragments of Druidic practice remained firmly embedded in the bardic teachings of the vision poets. Classical writers give conflicting accounts of the divisions of Druids, poets, and seers. During the insular pre-Roman conquest Celtic period, we find Druid, Ovate, and Bard. As time, conquest, and religious changes took their toll, these three roles became less defined, tending to overlap more and more. Let us look at their original definitions. The Druid was one who was proficient in the interrelation of the worlds of seen and unseen, especially for ordering the political and social patterns of life. He or she may have had the additional abilities of seer, judge, poet, prophet, or philosopher. The Druid often had a sacerdotal Brahmin character as an arbiter of social rectitude. The role of the Ovate was that of a prophet, diviner, and a sacrificer. The name may derive from the Indo-European root vat, to be inspired or possessed. The Ovate is defined by Strabo as an interpreter of nature. The same root underlies the names Odin and Wotan. Ovates worked in close association with Druids among the continental Celts, but the task of sacrificer is rarely alluded to in insular tradition where the prophetic and divinatory skills are prominent. Bard is a word that must be clearly contextualized since it can mean a variety of things. In Ireland, a bard could imply the meanest sort of entertainer and is defined by the Crith Gablach as one without lawful learning but his own intellect. Professional poets were called Fili, having undergone at least a 12-year training in poetics, prosody, versification, and the arduous oral memorization of traditional stories. In the 8th year of training, the arts of prophetic invocation and shamanic knowledge-seeking were taught. Only those who reached the heights of their profession were entitled to this name Olam, roughly equivalent to a very advanced doctorate in modern university parlance. In Britain, bards were poets with varying gradations of skill. At the top end was the pensard, or chief poet, who had won his chair through his commanding skills. His rank was on a par with court officials. At the bottom end was the minstrel who, like the Irish bard, would be attached to no household. Bards and poets were probably originally praise singers, but with the erosion of the Druidic and Vodic roles, the poetic class subsumed many Druidic and Vodic skills in their social function. The prophetic arts of the poet will be examined in more detail in the next chapter. The Fili class were probably always preoccupied with the workings of inspiration or Awen in an often frenzied and lovesick way. Too much inspiration brings divine madness, as in the case of Merlin. Inspiration was and is a pathway between the worlds without which this world becomes a dull wasteland. In the work of Taliesin, images of fountains and running water abound, and he sings lyrically of the mistress of Awen, Caradwyn. In the colloquy of the two sages between Ned and Fershant, we see the same preoccupation with the flowing of inspiration, this time addressed to Boan, the mistress of the Boyne, the mystical source of poetic fervor. In the three cauldrons of inspiration, we discover the source of inspiration and how its flow can be dispensed in a balanced way. But we begin this chapter with the study of Moraith and his daughter as archetypical druids. So, that goes on to yet more. And the thing I want to say to you is study more on your own accord. There is so much that can be said about the Druids and so much that can be learned from what we do know that it's just the most interesting thing about it all is that if Rome never existed and this civilization was allowed to flourish, how would it all have ended if they were untouched? Because the Druids had seen themselves as something extremely old. We know that. They could have been over 3,000 years old existing. It isn't very clear. So that's just a little bit about the Druids. Hope you guys have a good night. Please hit the subscribe button. Let people know I exist. And in the future, there will be many more episodes about Celtic magic, which is one of the things that we definitely need to touch on in this show. So until I see you guys later, have a good night. And here's a rockin' outro.